especially fantastic because we're joined by Dr. Ivannia Soto from Whittier College, and her second edition of her book that's on your screen right now is just about to hit the bookstores and Amazon March 23rd. So we're getting like a little sneak peek, super exciting. I was so glad she agreed to speak with us right before the launch of her book. So Dr. Soto is an associate professor of education at Whittier College. She specializes in second language acquisition, systemic reform for English language learners, and urban education. So Dr. Soto, thank you so much for joining us. It's such an honor to have you here. And everyone, please make sure you stay to the end of the presentation because Dr. Soto and Corwin Publishing have generously offered a discount for if you're interested in making a purchase on this book. So make sure you stay to the end to get that information on how to do that. Dr. Soto, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm introduction. I usually like to also add a little bit of a personal bio. I am a former multilingual learner myself. My first language was Spanish. I'm of Costa Rican descent, and my own story, my own educational journey is closely linked to my mother's journey when she immigrated to the United States when she was 9 years old. And she really struggled. I always like to keep her story at the forefront of my work and my research and my teaching because she really struggled to acquire English at a time when we really didn't know what to do, right, with our multilingual learners. And unfortunately, we see some of these same inequities, right, going on systemically in schools today. And the second edition of this book, like the first edition came out in 2012. So we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of shadowing. The first edition was called English Language ELL Shadowing, right? And you'll notice a shift in language here in the title, right? So shadowing multilingual learners. The language that we use, the labels that we use, right, are really important. And so, and you'll notice that, so if you Google the first edition, we had a young boy on the cover of the first edition, and this time we have a young girl. There are lots of other changes. I address how to shadow in a virtual setting, which is part of what you'll learn today, as well as how to shadow in a bilingual setting if you're teaching in a dual language setting. So with that, I guess the other thing I'd like to let you know is that this is going to be an interactive presentation. So during different times, different slides will have a chat box question that you are welcome to respond to for interaction. I'm trying to model sort of best practices. Okay, and so with that, here is a Wordle from one of, right, I've been shadowing actually since 2003. Shadowing started in the Los Angeles Unified School District in 2003. I was at the time an administrator in one of our local district offices. My superintendent tasked me with creating a way in which we could go into classrooms and take a look at what I call now a day in the life of an English learner or a multilingual learner. And so what we've been doing, right, since 2003 is really capturing the listening and speaking experiences specifically of our multilingual learners. You'll see here some of the key words that have emerged from some of these shadowing projects. So teachers have said, right, that their multilingual learners have been frustrated in classrooms, that the experience has been insightful, enlightening, that their students are sometimes confused, right? And so what I'd like to do for the first chat box response is tell me, what percentage of time do you believe or do you think that multilingual learners spend speaking academically in the classroom setting? And you can say, so hypothesize across a 6-hour day, what percentage of time would you say that a multilingual learner spends in academic oral language production? That is, that they are speaking either to a partner, or they're speaking to the teacher, or maybe in a small group setting. So I'm seeing 10%, 15%, 5, 15, some 30, less than 2. So the less than 2 is actually historically what has happened. This was pre-Common Core, a study by Diane August of the Center for Applied Linguistics. And she studied K through 12 classrooms, took a look at K through 12 classrooms, and monitored academic oral language, and found that it was less than 2% of a multilingual learner's school day. And if, right, we know that the way that language is acquired is through practice, right? And not through practice, right, a couple times a day, but that language needs to happen all day long. In my shadowing projects, what I typically do, I work with school districts, I consult with school districts as well. And with my shadowing projects post Common Core, I have found around 5 to 10% of a multilingual learner school day is spent in academic oral language production. Certainly that's better, right? 5 to 10 is better than the less than 2. And I oftentimes am asked, well, what are we looking for? What percentage are we looking for? We're looking for, Pauline Gibbons tells us, 30% of a multilingual learner school day spent in academic oral language production. And if that's the case, then we really need to be, as teachers, intentional about those opportunities, right, for our multilingual learners to speak and to actively engage in the classroom setting. I see a question here. Is this in English only? And so yes. So the shadowing can be done in a dual language setting, but historically, right, shadowing started in an English only setting. The study by Diane August was also in English. I've been working with the California Association for Bilingual Education over the last few years. We've done a lot of dual language shadowing recently, and I talk about it in the second edition of the book. And we have found that some of the same inequities happen, right? When we don't monitor our English, our multilingual learners carefully, that our multilingual learners might not be speaking as often either in a dual language setting. I'll be going over, I saw your question about what is shadowing. So shadowing, with shadowing, we focus in on the speaking and the listening experiences of our multilingual learners. And so what we tend to think that speaking and listening are not as important as reading and writing. We tend to think that, right, reading and writing are the heavy hitter domains. Those are the ones that I'm going to focus on. But really, right, speaking and listening are scaffolds for reading and writing. If I can speak before I write, I'm much more likely, right, to write clearly. If I'm able to partner, let's say with my partner Monica, right, and I talk to her about what I'm going to write about, then that, right, that is a scaffold, an oral language scaffold for the writing process. And similarly, listening is a scaffold for reading. If I can paraphrase what my partner said, that is a similar process to being able to summarize during reading. This is the shadowing observation form. I'm going to go over it more, a little more in depth towards the end of the presentation, but I kind of just want to show you that we're monitoring primarily academic speaking and academic listening during the shadowing process. We also take down anecdotal notes of different kinds under comments, but we really are focusing in on speaking and listening because those are the two most underdeveloped domains. And we're focusing in on one student at a time. Instead of 30 students, we really want to hone in on the experience of one multilingual learner in our classroom. And so with that, I kind of wanted to set the stage for this notion of the importance of speaking and listening before I actually get into the protocol and how to use it. And this typically happens in my professional developments as well. So Deborah Meyer tells us that teaching is listening and learning is talking. And then notice I put in the chat box, what does this quote mean to you? For me personally, it seems counterintuitive, right? We tend to think that the teacher should be doing the talking, right? That the teacher is the one who provides the content, right? Um, but here, Deborah Meyer turns this idea upside down, right? She is suggesting that we need to be good listeners as teachers, right? And that we need to allow our students to speak in the classroom setting because that's the way that they learn more. And I'm seeing in the comments, same thing, internalizing, generalizing content. When you speak, you consolidate your learning, use higher order thinking skills. Yes. Listening to inform our practice. Yes. So listening, right, to our students tells us where they, right, where they are. It's a formative assessment, right? If we listen carefully, and it tells us where they might need to go next. To learn, students need to have ownership, right, of the content. And that means as teachers, then we have to design our learning, right, students learning around speaking, and we really need to be intentional. Here are some of the benefits of talk for our multilingual learners. This is the work of Pauline Gibbons. And she tells us that our multilingual learners benefit from talk because they hear more language when they talk to each other. They speak more language, right? They take more language risks. They hear more language from a variety of sources, not just from the teacher, right? When we put students in groups, we have them collaborate, um, or work in pairs. They understand more language. They usually understand each other more than they understand us. They're more willing to ask questions. And overall, they're just more comfortable about speaking. What other benefits, if you haven't written them down in the chat box, what are some other benefits of talk for our multilingual learners? And I'll take a couple of those responses. So hearing more language, right? Speaking more language. They understand each other. They're more comfortable. I sometimes hear teachers say they are less fearful of errors, and that is, especially if we've created this community, right? This safe community for taking language risks. They gain confidence. Um, they make connections with their first language, especially if we allow for that, right, in the classroom setting. If we view that primary language as the asset that it is, right? It allows the teacher to prepare what they'll say next while students are talking. Okay, so anticipating, right, where the direction of the lesson or where students are. It builds confidence. It helps practice pronunciation. So lots of benefits, right? Which means that we really need to be, again, as teachers, intentional about those opportunities. I like to use what I call, and I want to go there next. Let me go there and then I'll come back. I like to use what I call the 15-minute rule in my own college teaching. And I hope that you see it kind of here laid out today as well. Where I won't talk for any more than 10 or 15 minutes. I chunk my lecture, if you will, my interactive lectures into 10 to 15 minutes, because that's really the amount of time that we can actively listen to anybody around. And so let me show you. So Wancott, two researchers, here we go, I went backwards. Davis and Wancott suggest that attention during lectures wanes after about 10 minutes. And they also suggest, these researchers, Wancott and Benjamin, that attention is highest at the beginning of the lecture. If that's the case, then it's so important for us as teachers to segment our compartmentalize, right, our lectures into 10 to 15-minute segments so that we're constantly requiring our students, right, to actively listen for those intentionally, right, for those 10 to 15 minutes. And notice, so the teacher talks 10 to 15 minutes here, and then there's some kind of chat box response. Or if maybe there's a partner talk that goes on in the breakouts. Then the teacher talks for another 10 to 15 minutes. We have, again, another chat box response. Notice you've had 2 chat box responses so far, right? So I'm trying to mirror this. The teacher talks again, and then maybe I end with some kind of breakout activity. Maybe in groups, they are using a strategy like reciprocal teaching, right? And so really being intentional as teachers regarding, right, how we design our lessons so that speaking and listening are required, not just reading and writing. And you'll notice there, I had a question. How do you see yourself using the 15-minute rule? So maybe if we take a couple of those responses, you can think through that, and throughout the presentation, you can also think through that. Notice that I'm emphasizing and continuing to emphasize, right, the importance of the 2 underdeveloped domains, right, of listening and speaking, because that's what we monitor during shadowing. At every 5-minute interval, we're taking a look at one multilingual learner, and we're monitoring what their speaking and listening interactions are. And so similarly, right, the domain of listening, we said, was a scaffold for reading, right? It's an underdeveloped domain, and yet it is one that can help us, that can help our students with reading, and in particular, reading comprehension and summarization. And again, Pauline Gibbons tells us that listening should not be a passive process. It should be an experience where students are thinking. They're thinking about meaning. They shouldn't just be thinking about individual sounds, right? So just like when we read, we can take a look at reading from the decoding, the phonemic awareness, the phonics realm. But then on the other end, we have comprehension, right? And so we want our multilingual learners to have both of those experiences, a rich listening, right, diet, just as we want them to have a rich reading diet, right? And that listening, again, should not just be about, right, sound discrimination. There are also different ways to listen. So we can have students listen socially, or we can have them listen academically. Notice I've put in red, I've highlighted in red, academic. The reason for that, it's much more difficult to listen academically, especially when you can't ask for clarification. Okay. And so, and that is a one-way listening experience. So everything highlighted here in red would be much more cognitively and linguistically demanding. We have to teach our students, all of our students, but especially our multilingual learners, and prepare them for different kinds of listening experiences. So if you're lecturing, you might say, I want you to listen for the gist, the overall, right, just the overall meaning. Or if it's a read aloud, listen for overall meaning. Or I want you to listen for these particular maybe story elements, right? So you really want to plan out not only your speaking, right, experiences with your multilingual learners, but also those listening experiences. And I see, so my question here was what insight does the corona, so I'm gonna have you listen to something. I have a listening activity for you, and it's based on a video called The Coronavirus Diaries. As you listen, I'd like you to listen for what insights these teenagers can give you about your own students. So notice, I've given you a listening task that is specific, okay? So what insights can these students give you about your own students? And let me start this. It's a quick little video. very relevant.
My name is Jonathan Carroll Madden. I'm a senior at Ballard High School.
My name is Haley Bruner. I'm 17.
My name is Mei Mei Xu. I'm 18 years old.
Hi, my name is Delaney Nelson. I'm 17 years old. I'm a junior at Nashua High School South from Nashua, New Hampshire, and this is my coronavirus diary.
The beginning of the quarantine was a horror movie. It just felt so weird.
My mom is an emergency room nurse and my dad is a firefighter. I mean, I've always been aware of the risk that my parents are at versus people who work an office job, but I think this has made it much, much more real.
The timing for this virus has been awful.
My biggest worry is about when will life go back to normal.
You know, I've been texting this one friend every day because I'm really, really worried about him.
We're really worried about the health of our employees and the health of our customers, but also just like not spreading the virus.
Personally, I think it's too soon to reopen.
I've always considered myself a pretty dedicated student, but I think it's tough for anyone to just have that amount of like intrinsic motivation to just finish all your schoolwork with no one else there.
I'm going to Harvard College next fall. What if we have to have Zoom Harvard?
We ought to be really grateful for the essential workers in our lives.
I just hope that this isn't happening in vain and that something will come from it.
Okay, so a really powerful to listen, right, to these students' voices as they are telling us, right, how they are experiencing the pandemic. And I think it's so important. I've been doing a whole bunch of little mini lessons, model lessons around the pandemic for that reason. So this kind of served two purposes. The question, the active listening question that I posed was, what insights did these students give you into what might be happening, right, to your students? So in the chat box, if we could take a couple of those responses, what insights? And this is intended, right, to be for you personally, but then also to think through how you can create active listening sorts of activities for your own students, right, alongside of an open-ended question. So what insights did these students give you? You can also unmute yourself if you'd like. Their unique perspectives. Students are feeling very stressed. I know many ELL students struggle with language, and maybe they are the language broker in their home. Our students are living the dangers. Peer interaction is so important to their performance, right? And it may be much more difficult for that to happen virtually, but not impossible, right? Breakouts are our friend. Being hopeful, they were concerned about others. Our students are losing loved ones. And so please don't be, please feel free, right, to unpack some of these themes with your own students. I start my graduate courses every week with an SEL activity. And early on, I had different social emotional learning prompts around, right? What are some ideas for, for the stress that's going on in my life, right? How can I assist my family? How can I do some self-care? All of those sorts of activities are helpful. But the emphasis here being, and what I'm trying to lead up to before I go into shadowing, is the importance of active listening and academic speaking, especially for our multilingual learners. Our multilingual learners make meaning through talk, right? They need those speaking opportunities in order to become proficient, but also more importantly, to be able to make meaning of texts and make meaning of what we're saying. And so notice with that video that I just showed, I had an open-ended question, right? What insights can those teenagers give you about your own students? And so Duchess May tells us that teachers who plan carefully crafted questions get deeper, more thoughtful responses. And so random acts of questioning are oftentimes not, right, as helpful for our students. We really want to be intentional about the open-ended questions that we pose, both in our chat box responses or during our breakouts. We want to make sure that our open-ended questions are connected to essential questions, to the objective of the lesson, and some of the benefits of open-ended questions is that they require more language, right? Part of what we're trying to do is to increase that less than 2% of a multilingual learner school day spent in academic oral language production. We want to get that, remember, our goal is around 30%. So our open-ended questions are our friends in that way. They're a scaffold to get us there. It allows for longer stretches of language. So oftentimes our multilingual learners will give us maybe a 1 or 2 word response, and we want to stretch that out. Open-ended questions assist with that because typically, right, there isn't a right or wrong answer. It increases our multilingual learners' use of details because they have to justify their thinking. They have to go back into the text to support their thinking. And it allows students to enter into conversations on their own terms so that they are really taking charge, right? And depth of knowledge, right? These depth of knowledge levels are so helpful to us because we don't want our open-ended questions to remain at the recall, reproduction stage. We want to make sure that we get them to the strategic thinking, the abstract thinking, where they have to justify, as I said before, their responses, where they have to synthesize information, and where they use multiple sources, right, to respond to a question. And so I like to use, in the second part of the multilingual, the Shadowing Multilingual Learners book, has a whole bunch of strategies for active listening and strategies for academic oral language. One of the academic oral language strategies is what I call the Think, Pair, Share 2.0. With the Think, Pair, Share 2.0, there is a writing portion and there is a consensus portion. So multiple opportunities for speaking. The student has an open-ended question that the teacher poses ahead of time or plans for ahead of time. The student has some think time to think about their response. And then the student has to actively listen to his or her partner. And I'm actually going to ask Monica to model this with me here in a second. And then the last piece would be a synthesis. So synthesizing what both partners said and to determine what they're going to share with the whole group. So the open-ended prompt that I want Monica and I to model is going to be, what has been your virtual rose and what has been your virtual thorn? And everybody in the group, as you're watching us do this, you can also put your responses in the chat box. But so what has been your virtual rose, Monica, and then what has been your virtual thorn? And I'll go first just because I've done it before. You can give students sentence frames. So what I believe is that my virtual rose and my virtual thorn are sort of the same, in that I've been pedagogically challenged to teach in a virtual setting, to use new techniques, right? But the thorn has been that those techniques don't always work. So Monica is going to now paraphrase what I just said.
Okay, so Dr. Soto said that her virtual rose is that she's challenging herself with new pedagogical techniques, but that the thorn is that oh geez, now I'm getting I'm getting flustered. That you're not always implementing them. Is that what the gist of it?
Myself, that I'm not always, that they don't always turn out the way I'd like.
Oh, turn out, yeah.
And so sometimes when you're talking to your partner, you do have to ask for clarification, especially at the end of a long day, right? And that's perfectly fine. So what I'm going to do now, so then what I would do here is I would say, yes, that's correct, Monica. And then Monica would put my response under what my partner thought. So now I'm going to listen to Monica.
Okay.
And what was your thorn?
My virtual rose is that I love that I'm getting so much family engagement, that entire families are showing up to my Zoom classes. And so I think that's exciting to have that engagement. My virtual thorn is that even a year into the pandemic, we're still struggling with some tech issues and Wi-Fi issues with some families.
Mm-hmm. So what I heard you say is that you've had a lot of family engagement that has been your rose. And so families are, since they're around, they might be, participating or willing to participate more openly. And then your virtual thorn is that there are still some Wi-Fi issues going on even a year afterwards. So Monica's nodding her head.
Yes.
I now have her permission, and I'm going to write down under listening what my partner said. Then Monica and I would have a second conversation, and we would decide if there were any similarities between our ideas. And if so, then that's what we would share. Or maybe I just want Monica to share her response. So we would decide who's going to share what with the whole class, because it's an individual conversation first. This can happen virtually in breakout rooms. So you can put 4 students together. 2 of them will have the conversation. The other 2 can provide feedback and actively listen for different things. And then they switch. Okay. What I really like about this graphic organizer, this is the graphic organizer, is that then there's accountability for the conversation, right? There's a narrative, right, that is transcribed, if you will, around the conversation to make sure everybody's on task. So I'm seeing thank you, Monica. I'm seeing in the chat box some thorns, technological issues, so similar to Monica. Not commuting to work, yeah, that has been really helpful. Learning to use a lot of digital materials, right? New apps, and I hope that continues, right? Moving forward. Working from home has allowed me to really include different resources. There are no substitutes, yes, for face-to-face. No commuting all over the city as an adjunct. So definitely, I hear you. LA traffic is real bad too. So with that kind of sets the stage, right? That hopefully for you all, that academic speaking and listening are just as important as the domains of reading and writing, right? And that's what we're focusing in on when we shadow a multilingual learner. The purpose of shadowing is to get a glimpse of the levels of productive speech and active listening that occur or do not occur in K through 12 classrooms. So we're going to monitor the production, at every 5-minute interval. The objective is to open eyes, not to point fingers. So we want to become self-reflective about our own practices. We don't want to point fingers at the family, the community, the student, right? We want to recognize how the presence and absence of productive speech and listening affects student learning. So if my students are sitting quietly all day long, right? How does that affect them as human beings, but also how does that affect them academically? It serves as a shared second language experience for schools, for districts, and county offices. I typically work with school districts over 2 to 3 years to kind of get up to that 30%. It takes time and ongoing professional development to get there. And it takes year after year, not having just what I call drive-by professional development, but sustained professional development that helps us to disrupt silence, right? On behalf of our multilingual learners. And it acts as a bridge of our study of research-based strategies. right? What these, I propose in the second half of the book, 3 research-based strategies. You saw one with the Think, Pair, Share 2.0. The second is the Freire model, and the third is reciprocal teaching. And so this is the result of our very first shadowing experience. I mentioned at the beginning that shadowing started in 2003 in the Los Angeles Unified School District. And one teacher said, the person talking the most is the person who's learning the most. And I'm doing the most talking in my classroom, right? So this teacher became self-reflective around the fact that, right, she was engaged in too much of the control and too much of the talk, and that she needed to gradually release that to her students. I also like to use this quote by Sandra Cisneros from her memoir, A House of My Own. And she tells us, at home I was fine, but at school I never opened my mouth except when the teacher called on me. I didn't like school because all they saw was the outside of me. And, you know, you wouldn't think that this would have been the case for somebody as prolific as Sandra Cisneros, but she goes on in her memoir to discuss how she struggles at the college level. She's an English major. Even in her MFA program, right? She has a lot to say, but it has never, right? Just like in shadowing, it has never been required of her. And so I always like to keep her at the forefront as well, because she represents, right? How many Sandra Cisneroses might we have in our classrooms? And if we would just elicit their voices, right? How much would they have to say? And so a chat box response, what are you hearing is the purpose of shadowing. So now that we've had a couple, I set the stage with listening and speaking. I unpacked the purpose of shadowing. What are you hearing? And then what do you think the possible impact might be? And I'll give you some think time. I'm going to close this door while you write down a couple of responses. Sorry. We're having work done. Okay. Okay, so what are you hearing is the purpose of shadowing? Student accountability for conversation. Yes. So taking a look at, right? Taking a look at first their speaking and listening experiences, and then holding them, but then holding ourselves accountable, right? As educators as well for student conversations, and requiring that to determine how much academic oral discourse is happening. It's an informal assessment, yes, that doesn't feel like an assessment in the speaking and listening domain, great. It allows you to experience school through the eyes of your student. Yes, love that. So in that sense, right, we usually don't have the luxury of observing one student at a time in our classrooms, right? We usually, we're taking a look at the needs of 36, or right, secondary folks 180 a day, right? And so this helps us to slow everything down and take a look at school from the lens of our multilingual learners and their specific experiences, enabling student-centered conversations, reflecting on our practice. Yes, yes. So taking a look at how might we rearrange some of our lessons, right? So that we do build in open-ended questions. We do require talk and active listening. So lots of great ideas coming through. So here are some virtual shadowing options that, you know, obviously I also had to pivot. So I was talking earlier about my virtual rose and thorn. And so with shadowing, I still had interest from schools and districts. And so these are some of the ways that you can shadow moving forward while we're still working virtually. You can record your own lesson in Zoom or whatever, you know, LMS, if you're using, you know, Google Meets or whatever it may be, and select one of your own MLL students and complete the shadowing protocol at every 5-minute interval, kind of after the fact. That's kind of, it's sort of what national board certification, you know, teachers videotape themselves, and then they have to, you know, they have different reflective activities. So it's kind of that approach. You can shadow one of your own MLL students during a breakout or a group session. So a little bit at a time. I should say that I typically recommend at least 1 hour, preferably 2 hours. They could be done, 2 days in a row if you don't have, or a little bit at a time. You can break that apart. I usually also recommend 2 different content areas because a multilingual learner may be really quiet during, let's say, their English language arts time, but they may love their math class, right? Or another class, and they may just, speak a whole lot more, become a whole other person in that other content area. So I like having 2 content areas. You can shadow an MLL in another classroom. So you would have to obtain permission and a sub to do this. This is how we usually conduct a face-to-face shadowing, is we would all have a day of professional development. I would, spend more time doing this with you all. And then the second half of the day or the next day, we would actually go into classrooms and shadow for 2 hours in somebody else's classroom. So we would have to obtain that permission. So we would need a sub as well. What's typically, the teacher knows we're coming. The teacher knows we're coming to observe. The teacher may not know exactly why we're coming to shadow. Or that we're coming to shadow, because we don't want fancy lessons to be given, right? We want whatever it is, whatever normal practice is, that's the data that we want to collect. And remember, we're not shadowing the teacher, we're shadowing the student, right? And we want teachers to be clear about that. You can also shadow using Jeff Swear's videos, which I'm going to show you how to do in a bit. So Jeff Swear's has a set of 9 videos that are short. They're about 3 minutes each. And I have been having participants or teachers shadow at the beginning and end of each of those videos, because to kind of capture the 5-minute interval. We typically start with face-to-face shadowing, or if you're shadowing in your own classroom or somebody else's, we like to get as much information about the multilingual learner as we can, because after all, right, they're a human being. They're not, right? They're not just a number, right? And so we typically want their photo, right? If we're in somebody else's classroom, we want to be able to identify that student. The first name, date of birth, date of entry in US, date of entry in the district. I like to get test results for 3 years because I like to see patterns over time in terms of achievement. I also like to analyze strengths first. So what is this multilingual learner's strength, right? In terms of, and these are, sorry, California terms. So this would be the language assessment. This would be the content assessment, whatever it is you use in New York. Grades, GPA, unit assessments. So we want as much data as possible. And then here's the English learner protocol. We would transfer the information, the demographic information from the student profile to the top of the form. You'll notice that there is a timestamp. There is an activity section we take down at every 5-minute interval. Who is speaking, and in particular, we take down what our multilingual learner is doing specifically. So we're not monitoring everybody, right? All 30 students. We're not monitoring the teacher. We're monitoring our multilingual learner. We have 7 codes for speaking. If my student is speaking to another student, that's a 1. If my EL is speaking to the teacher, that's a 2. If my EL is speaking to in a small group, 3 or 4, that's a 3. If my EL is speaking to the whole class, presenting to the whole class, that's a 4. We do have a couple of coding options for the teacher, just because we know that, either the student is speaking or the teacher is speaking. And the teacher speaking to my MLL is a 5. The teacher speaking to my MLL in a small group of 3 or 4 is a 6, and the teacher lecturing to the whole class is a 7. We have fewer codes for academic listening. If my MLL is listening to another student, that's a 1. If my MLL is listening to the teacher, that's a 2. If my MLL is listening in a small group, 3 or 4, that's a 3. And if my MLL is listening to the whole class, like a chant or a song, that's a 4. Sometimes students aren't required to speak or listen. So if they're reading or writing, that's a 1. And if they're off task, that's a 2. The anecdotal information here is just as important as the coding process. So, and it should complement whatever is going on under activity. So we write down under activity what we see happening first at the start of the 5-minute interval. Anything that happens after the start of the 5-minute interval goes under comments. And so here are some examples of what we might see in the classroom setting. So 10:15, we might see a quick write. I might take down some comments. My ELL is writing briefly and then off task. Then I have to go back to my coding. If my ELL is writing, then my MLL is not speaking or listening. So I would code it as a 1. I'm going to show you how to use Jeff Swear's videos alongside of this. So as I'm showing you this video, these are what's really nice about using Jeff Swear's videos is that they are exemplar videos. And so you're going to be seeing best practice. You're going to be seeing MLLs who have been working on speaking for some time, right? And so I'm going to show you just the first part of the video and then how I would take down and code what I saw.
What do you think an important theme in this book? An important theme of this book is real quick. We do that?
Okay, so let me go back to that because that's what I would take. I would watch the whole video, but I would only take down under activity what I saw first at the start of the 5-minute interval. Okay.
I think an important theme in this book. An important theme of this book is real quick.
Okay, so that first student, this student here is the one that I'm going to count as my MLL, the one who speaks first. So then I'm going to go back to my coding system, back to my protocol sheet, and I would write down exactly what I saw happen. Right. And what's nice about the videos is that then you can rewind, right? If you record yourself, you can do the same. So notice, so the start of the video, what do you think so what happened first? My MLL, asked his partner, what do you think an important theme of the book is? And then I put here what the partner responded. An important theme is real courage. I only code what I see first, right? So how would I code that? So obviously my MLL is speaking, but how would I code that? And go ahead and put that in the chat box. What number under academic speaking might you use? Or might you check off? And you usually only check off 1. Good. And it's a 1, right? Because my MLL is speaking to another student, that's a 1. The video goes on to have at the very end. So what I would do with the videos is I take down what I see first and I take down what happens at the very end. Okay. At the very end, what happens is the MLL listens to the partner explain. So people see that he isn't bad. So in this case, my MLL is listening. So then I would move over to my active listening column. How might I code that? Who is my MLL listening to? And then I look over at my comments. My comments say MLL listens to partner carefully and makes eye contact. So not only is my MLL listening, but also making eye contact. So student listening mostly to student. Good. So that would be a 1. What we usually do during a prolonged, shadowing training, we would make sure that we had inter-rater reliability, right? We would make sure that we all knew how to use This protocol sheet, we would go through many different examples, right? So many different situations. And these are some do's and don'ts for shadowing. So I recommend that you shadow at the school level of your assignment. So if you're elementary, shadow first at the elementary level, middle school, high school. Become familiar with the forms, right? You would have gone through some practice with me. There's a whole chapter on how to use the protocol in the book. And then making sure to maintain focus on the student, right? Not the other students, but my one, right? My MLL who was assigned to me. If I'm shadowing in my own classroom because I've recorded my lesson, if there's a student you're concerned about, you might want to shadow that student. I've also had SEL, Standard English Learner shadowing. I've had dual identification of MLLs and students with special needs shadowing, and then have contrasted data that way as well. Don't ask for a boutique assignment. So if you're going into somebody else's classroom, don't say, hey, show me your best stuff. Remember, this isn't an evaluation. It is what it is, whatever has happened, right? It's about the student's experience, not the teacher. Don't ask the student any formal questions. We don't want the student to know that they're being shadowed, okay? Just because it changes the data collection, right? And when the teacher knows exactly why we're there, they also, what I usually say is, I'm coming into the classroom to take a look at maybe just overall English learner needs, right? But then I won't say I am shadowing Josue, right? Because then I'm going to overcall on Josue, right? Don't share any evaluative statements about the teacher or the class. So even if you say good job, right, then that's an evaluative statement. And so we want to avoid that. And so our last chat box response is, if you have been intrigued by shadowing, how do you think you might enter into shadowing? Would you perhaps use those videos? Would you do it during a breakout? Would you, the videos that, would you use the Jeff Swears videos? Would you record your own? Go into somebody else's classroom? So choose one of those that maybe interests you. And then what kind of MLL would you shadow? We know that there are different kinds of, right? You might have long-term English learners. You may have more newcomers. So it's really important, right, to make sure that we are selecting or doing this purposefully, right, in a way that it might help us with our own instructional practices to understand that kind of MLL. So I'm seeing I would start with Jeff Swears first. I think that is a good way to get started, especially right now during the pandemic. When we come back face to face, you know, then going back to perhaps going into somebody else's classroom or recording your own, you know, I see a lot of that. I saw a question that I want to go back to. So would you listen to how many intervals? So I saw a question, Sandy. So how many intervals would you listen for? So good. So I want to go back to that. And any other questions that you have, please put them in the chat box so they can answer them. So this protocol sheet represents 20 minutes. And then I recommended that we do this for an hour at the very least, and then 2 hours best practice. So we would need, for 2 hours, we'd need, right, 6 of these. And so making sure that we have enough of the printouts to be able to shadow for that period of time. I'm seeing, yes, 2 hours. So 1 hour would be, right, the very least, because you kind of really want to get a sense of a multilingual learner's experience across an entire class period. And then you can split it up though too, across maybe 20 minutes each day or something for 3 days, however you'd like it, however you can kind of get that accomplished. Knowing how to, yes, Sandy, thank you. Yes, so you really want to practice with the shadowing protocol. before you, and I'm going to go ahead and put this up in case you would. And so the book details very explicitly how to use the protocol sheet for speaking and then for listening, and then how to use the comments section as well. So it would unpack, and yes, and we usually, when I do this in a professional development setting, we practice it several times, right? Before I actually have teachers go into classrooms and use the protocol. Oh, good. Thank you, Karen. I work in pre-service education. We've had them shadow. It's one of my signature assignments as well. We abandoned it with COVID, but the Jeff Swears, yes. No, I had to pivot as well, Karen, in the last spring. And that's where I found his videos, and they're exemplars. So it doesn't get the full or the same impact with the videos, but at least with our pre-service teachers, then they would be seeing best practice, right? Good practices. Where do you recall all the data? Okay, yes, so typically what we do with the data is I'm using Google Docs now. So usually I would put them up on posters, and teachers would put up all their tally marks. We would get an aggregate, right? Of all the teachers in as part of the professional development. So let's say we had 30 teachers, each teacher would represent that MLL. They would put up how many times the student was listening to one other student, to the teacher, all of those codes that we had, the 7 codes for speaking, the 4 codes for listening. And then we would decide, right? If we were at 5 to 10%, what districts have started to do is to make goals, incremental goals each year. So if we're at 5% this year, maybe next year we want to be at 10%. And by year 3, we want to get to 20% with ongoing professional development, right? Making sure that that is happening. Yes, I will put the website I'll put the website and the code in the chat box. And then, yeah, did we have any other questions? Did you see any other questions while I do that, Monica? Sorry.
I will scroll through and look.
Okay, what qualifications do you need in order to do the shadowing? Can anyone do this? I would say I feel most comfortable having teachers do this once they have at least read, right? I also have an article, so if you're really interested in it, and you know, times are tough, you can't purchase the book, I understand. I have an article, and I'll put that in the chat box. It's called Listening and Learning, and you can Google that and my name, and it'll come up, and that also will tell you how to shadow if you're really interested in that. So at the very least, read the article, best practice, read the book, right? So that you're really prepared. Do you have any recommendations for conducting shadowing in early childhood education settings, K to 2? Yeah. Oh no, I've done it, you know, K to 16, and it works the same it works the same in K to 2 settings. The professional development changes in terms of teaching the Think, Pair, Share 2.0. I would use additional scaffolds. We have a Think, Pair, Share chant that we use. We have speaking and listening cards with ears and with lips. So that piece changes, but yeah, it's similar. It can be done at any age, any age group. In kindergarten, I find I've had like students come up to me and ask me interesting questions, you know, like, can you tie my shoe, right, in the middle of a shadowing experience? But you learn so much, right, at all grade levels when you shadow. Do they have to be speaking English the whole time? Say they're discussing the lesson in their first language. Oh no, so you can, so I address translanguaging in the new edition, and it actually helps in a dual language setting to shadow for the language allocation piece. It can help you monitor that piece as well. It's also very interesting to be able to transcribe students, language at every 5-minute interval. So, one thing I did not say earlier is that this is not a running record. You are taking down what you hear first, right? At the start of the 5-minute interval, what you see first. So lots of great ideas, lots of great questions, lots of options right there. You have the article. Corwin is offering the 20% off if you're interested in that. And I'm just checking to see.
And Dr. Soto, once you have your data collected, do you then suggest having a team meeting with anyone who works with that specific child to review the data and make a plan?
Yes. A lot of it is self-reflection, right? On our part, I don't recommend sharing it with the teachers in a sort of in a kind of an evaluative way, right? But instead, in an overall, this is what I noticed. Let's take a look at the data together, inviting that teacher, if you're working with somebody else, to also shadow so that they have the experience. Yes, and oh yeah, so definitely you want to have a debrief session. That's a chapter in the book as well. How to debrief the data. So what are the quantitative tallies telling us? What are the qualitative comments? What are the themes and patterns going on here, right? For the students. Good, thank you. Okay. Is the protocol available for all grade levels? Yes, it's the same protocol for any grade level. And how do you fill out the form if they are using their home language as well? So what's nice is you can take it down, and if you don't know the primary language, then you can translate it later to see what was going on as closely as possible. If you're recording it, then you can go back and listen to it and translate it, or have somebody help you translate it. But it is really helpful to take down both languages. Thank you. I think those were all of the questions. Thank you all for being here, especially after working so hard and it's snowing there. I won't tell you what the temperature is out here, but I love New York. Yes, I miss traveling to New York. So
thank you so much, Dr. Soto, for joining us. I think this is such a, I think we all are, find this as something we can apply, in whatever environment we're working in. I think it's something that we all want to do, and yet you've provided us the tools to make it something that we can actually do. We need that little push and the forms and everything laid out to make it something we can actually do. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was very good.
Thank you for joining. Have a great night.
No problem.